Hi, good evening, sir. Good evening, everyone. Am I audible?
Good evening, madam. I am you are audible. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Okay, thank you.
Sir, we can wait for 5 more minutes, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Hi, good evening, everyone. The session is not started yet. We'll start now. Hi, Vinay sir. Shall we start now?
Yes, let us start.
Yes, sir. We are starting the session. This is our last session of National Tax Lecture webinar series. Warm welcome, Vinay sir. Welcome, everyone. Over to you, sir. We can start now.
Okay. So, good afternoon, everybody. Today we are going to discuss. Good afternoon, everyone. So today we are going to discuss the constitutional provisions which are relevant to the taxation and particularly with respect to goods and services tax and some of the important principles which has emerged over a period of time to interpret a statute. So the interpretation of statute part we will be going to do more particularly with reference to the taxation provisions. So first and foremost, Article 265 says that, one second. So Article 265 says that no tax can be levied without authority of law. So it means that if any tax has to be recovered, then it should be done either by way of an ordinance or an order or rules, regulation, notification, or even customs or uses can be said to have a force of the law depending on the facts and circumstance of a case. So that is what is mentioned in Article 13, sub-article 3. Now, with respect to the legislative power per se itself, so prior to the GST regime, the legislative power for taxation was derived from Article 246, which said that the laws can be made by the parliament, state, or both with respect to the matters which are listed in list 1, list 2, and list 3. List 1 is union list. That means only the parliament has the power to legislate with respect to the items specified in list 1. With respect to the subject matters provided in list 2, only the state has the power to legislate. And with respect to the state list 3, either center or state or both of them can legislate. But the difficulty of earlier era was that only the union had the power to levy tax with respect to manufacture of the goods and interstate purchase and sale of the goods and provision of services, while state only had the power to levy tax with respect to intrastate sale and purchase of the goods. So similarly, the power was divided by the union and states. But the GST mandated that it will be a uniform taxation and a harmonious tax structure. So the fundamental objective was to remove the various rate of tax, various provision of the law all across the country. So therefore, a constitution amendment was made in 2016 in order to bring into force the goods and service tax regime. And here, Article 246A empowered both the union and states to simultaneously levy tax or enact law with respect to goods and services tax. But it restricted the power of the states to formulate law on the interstate supplies. So, as we all know that central goods and state goods and services tax are there for any transaction which is done intrastate transaction, but for interstate transaction, IGST is there, integrated goods and service tax is there, which the union has formulated, which the parliament has legislated. Now comes the another important article, which is Article 269A. In the meanwhile, Article 268A was omitted, which empowered the union government to levy tax on services. At the same time, several entries in List 1 and List 2 were also omitted or suitably amended to ensure that there is no power of the union or the state, so that exclusive power is not there. So it is for the first time that this Article 246 say it is a one of a kind article in the Constitution of India, because it gives simultaneous power to both the union and state to levy tax. Now, Article 269 again was a new article which was inserted to provide that the parliament will enact the law with respect to interstate trade and commerce. And it will also formulate the principle for determining the place of supply or when the goods or supply takes place in the course of interstate trades or commerce. So not only the power to legislate with respect to interstate trade and commerce was given to the Union of India, but at the same time, power to define or state what is interstate trade and commerce is also in the hand of the Union of India. Now, Article 271 was also amended, which restricted the power of the parliament to levy surcharge under GST. So effectively now no surcharge can be levied under the goods and service tax regime. Further, one of the very important article is Article 279A. Now, Article 279A is the article relating to Constitution and the powers of the Goods and Service Tax Council. Now, the purpose of the Goods and Service Tax Council was to enable passing the concurrence of both the union and state while formulating the model GST law, the rate of tax, threshold limit for taxation, and all such things. So, as we all know that the Goods and Service Tax Council minutes takes place every now and then. There is no mandate as with respect to when it should take place, but it takes place as and when it is required to amend any provision of the act or the rule. So any act, rule or exemption or change in the rate of tax, it cannot be done unless it is approved by the Goods and Service Tax Council. Now, the composition of the Goods and Service Tax Council is that 1/3 of the voting power is with the central government. 2/3 of the combined voting power is with all the states, and the decision of the GST Council can only be taken with a 3/4 majority. Give me 1 second, please. Now, one question which arises in our mind rather is whether a common citizen can approach a Goods and Service Tax Council directly to adjudicate their grievances. So herein there is a judgment of the Honorable Kerala High Court that there is no mechanism provided either in the Constitution or any other statute for the Goods and Service Tax Council to adjudicate upon the grievances raised by the general public. So, while the Goods and Service Tax Council cannot adjudicate or decide any issue, but at the same time, they can make a recommendation to either the state or the union to formulate the law in a particular manner. And so, it is only the parliament or the respective assembly of the states which can redress the grievance of the citizen, but the GST Council is empowered to give recommendation to the parliament and the states to redress the grievance which is raised by a common man. Now, another issue which arose before the Honorable Supreme Court, whether the recommendation of the GST councils are binding on the union and the states. So here, this issue was also decided by the Honorable Supreme Court, and it said in the Union of India versus Mohit Mineral that GST councils recommendations are not binding. They are only recommendatory, and it does not create a binding obligation on the parliament or the states to follow the recommendation of the GST Council. But till now, whatever rule or act or the recommendations which have been given by the GST councils have been followed, and the law has been formulated in accordance with such recommendation. Now, in another, important recent judgment, where the issue was whether on the introduction of the GST, the tax exemptions which were withdrawn, whether doctrine of promissory estoppel will apply. Doctrine of promissory estoppel means the state or the union cannot go back on their promise. So it was argued that since on the promise of the government, the factories were installed or the factories were set up, so withdrawal of the tax exemption goes against the doctrine of promissory estoppel and the Union of India should be directed to accommodate that tax exemption in the GST era by way of a refund or some other mechanism. So the union said that the promise was given by the center and it cannot be given in any which manner through the Goods and Service Tax Act, but center was giving 58% of that reimbursement of the GST, and rest of the 42% the state should give. So in this backdrop, it was observed by the Honorable Supreme Court that the GST Council is a constitutional body which has the power to make recommendation. And that power includes recommendation of granting of exemption. So while the Supreme Court said that the doctrine of promissory estoppel does not apply, but at the same time, it said that since the GST Council has the power to give recommendation, so it would be appropriate that such recommendation is given by the GST Council to the states. Center is already reimbursing 58%. So the balance 58% reimbursement, even if the doctrine of promissory estoppel does not apply, but it urged the GST Council to make appropriate recommendation to the state. And it was also said that the state should positively consider such recommendation of the GST Council and should reimburse the units which we are enjoying the benefit of the tax exemption or the tax holiday in the previous tax era. Now coming to some other important articles of the Constitution of India. Article 14 to my mind is the most important article because it strikes at the arbitrariness in the state action, whether it is a legislative action or whether it is an executive action. So if any action of the government is arbitrary, unreasonable, or discriminatory, then Article 14 springs to the action and comes to the rescue of a citizen. And it remedies a situation where state or the government takes unreasonable action. So it not only strikes at the arbitrariness in the action, but also in the inaction. So if suppose arbitrarily some authority is supposed to act in accordance with a particular provision, for example, they should grant refund within a reasonable period of time. But if they fail to do so, then in terms of Article 14, the citizens are entitled to approach the courts and say that they are violating Article 14 of the Constitution of India. So therefore, they should be directed to take action in accordance with the law. Many times it so happens that many of the things which should be done are not done. We keep writing letters to the authorities, but they don't take any action. Even such inaction, if they are mandated to act, or it is reasonable to expect that they should give some response, then not doing something is also arbitrary and unreasonable, and Article 14 comes to the rescue. Now, taking recourse to the Article 14, a taxation law, whether it is a particular provision of the Act or the rule, that can also be challenged if it is arbitrary. And Honorable Supreme Court in the case of Saira Banu versus Union of India defined that Manifest arbitrariness means something which is done by the legislature capriciously, irrationally, or without adequate determining principle, or something done which is excessive and disproportionate. So the scope of Article 14 is very, very wide, and we should take recourse to Article 14 as and when the situation warrants. Recently, Section 3rd proviso to Section 245, subsection 2A of the Income Tax Act was struck down, being offending to Article 14 of the Constitution of India by the Honorable Supreme Court in the case of Deputy Commissioner of Income Tax versus Pepsi Food Limited, as it allowed automatic vacation of the stay after 365 days. So Honorable Supreme Court said that while the automatic stay was vacated after 365 days, the law does not look into whether it was due to the assessee that there was a delay in hearing of the appeal. And if not so, then you cannot make to suffer someone who has not contributed to such a delay. And therefore, it was held that treating unequals equally is discriminatory, and therefore, such a provision is liable to be struck down. Now, in the context of GST, this judgment is very useful because we know that in terms of Article 16(2) subsection clause C, the input tax credit is denied if the tax is not paid by the supplier. Now, in this context, adopting the similar principle that unequals cannot be treated equally, it was held that denying input tax credit to a buyer of the goods who has not colluded with the supplier would be treating equals unequally, in the sense that the guilty purchaser and the innocent purchaser will be treated one and the same. And this very well celebrated judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court was upheld by the Honorable Supreme Court of the Delhi High Court, was upheld by the Honorable Supreme Court in a judgment which the citation I have given in this slide. Now, another important article is Article 19(1)(g). It says that all citizens shall have the right to practice any profession or to carry on any trade or occupation or business. So as long as any reasonable restriction is imposed in the public interest or in the interest of justice, it is all right. But if some excessive, disproportionate action is taken, then it will violate, or even if such law is framed, then it will violate Article 19(1)(g), and such an action or the law is liable to be struck down. We know that in the era of the GST, provisional attachment of bank account has become a norm rather than rule, even though there are judgments of the Honorable Supreme Court which says that it should be adopted as a means of the last resort. So Honorable Supreme Court, in one of the judgments not relating to tax, but some important observations were made, saying that the banking channels provide the lifeline of any business or profession. So the moment a person is deprived of the facility of operating of bank account, or it is attached, then it results in automatic shutting down of the business, and therefore it violates Article 19(1)(g). So in one of the another judgment, while testing the validity of a law imposing a restriction on the carrying on of a business or profession, the Honorable Supreme Court formulated that such restriction should be evaluated on the basis of whether it has direct or indirect impact on the fundamental right of the citizen, whether the larger public interest sought to be ensured, the necessity to restrict the citizens' freedom, the inherent perilous nature of the act prohibited or its capacity or tendency to be harmful to the general public, the possibility of achieving the same object by imposing a less drastic restraint. Now, in another judgment relating to 19(1)(g), the Honorable Gujarat High Court struck down Rule 8(3) capital A of the Sandwich Credit Rules because it restricted the utilization of Sandwich credit if there is a default in payment of the tax for 3 months. So it was held that such a restriction, irrespective of the nature of the default or whether it was done deliberately, it leads to a situation so drastic and so harsh that if somebody, say, has defaulted in the payment of the tax, then it will throw him into further trouble because on the first hand, he does not have the financial liquidity to pay his taxes, and further, his rightful input tax credit is also debarred from being used. Then his business is likely to be severely impacted. And it is a serious affront to his right to carry on trade or business. And therefore, such a rule was struck down. One second, please. Now, another problem which has arose in the era of the GST is, am I audible now? Okay. So this judgment was in the context of the cancellation of the registration. So Honorable Supreme Court decided about 42 petitions together where the registration was cancelled. And it was said by the Honorable Supreme Court that the goods and service tax cannot be interpreted in such a manner that the SSC is debarred from either obtaining registration or reviving of the lapsed or cancelled registration, as it would not only go against the Article 19(1)(g), but also in violation of Article 14 and Article 21 of the Constitution of India. So it said that the GST provisions cannot be interpreted to deny the right to carry on the trade and commerce of a citizen, and the constitutional guarantee is unconditional, and to deny such right would militate against the right enshrined under Article 14, 19(1)(g) and the 21 of the Constitution of India. The Honorable Uttarakhand High Court also said that the GST registration affects the chances of getting employment or executing work. So thus denial affects his right to livelihood. And if his livelihood is denied, then it is violative for Article 21, which is relating to right to life. So right to livelihood is equivalent to right to life, and therefore such a right cannot be denied. Now coming to the interpretation of the statutes, now the first and foremost principle is that if the language is very clear, then it should be the law should be literally interpreted as if on the plain reading of the act, the law is very clear and there is no scope of ambiguity, then the law should be read as written by the parliament, as passed by the parliament or the assembly. But the second important principle is that the purposive interpretation. Now, in this context of this is always a debate whether the purposive interpretation should be done or whether the object of the purpose of the law should be looked into, or whether the literal interpretation will prevail. So herein, in a very recent Supreme Court judgment, it was said that it is clear, I'm just reading out from here, it is clear on a reading of English, US, Australian and our own Supreme Court judgment that the Lakshman Rekha has been extended to move away from the strictly literal rule of interpretation back to the rule of Old English case of Haydn, where the court must have recourse to the purpose, object, text, and context of a particular provision before arriving at a judicial result. In fact, the wheel has turned full circle. It started out by the rule as stated in 1584 in Haydn's case, which was then waylaid by the literal interpretation rule laid down by the Privy Council and in the House of Lords in mid-1800. And it has come back to restate the rule somewhat in terms of what was more felicitously put over 400 years ago in Haydn's case. So now what the Supreme Court says is that while literal interpretation is all right, but we must look into the purpose, object, text, and context of a particular provision before we arrive at the meaning of a particular provision. Now, another important principle of interpretation is harmonious interpretation. So we have to avoid conflict between different provisions of the law, and they should be harmoniously constructed to avoid conflict with each other. So it may be possible that two provisions of the law appears to be apparently contradictory to each other, but an interpretation should be made which does not render one of them redundant or negatory or nil. So a reasonable construction should be done to the extent possible to read all the provision of the law and not to read anything in isolation, and particularly when the subject matter in the different section are the same or similar in nature. Further, the rule of interpretation says that it depends on the text and the context. They are the basis of the Constitution. So while the text is the texture, context is what it gives the color. Neither can be ignored. Both are important. So that interpretation is the best which makes the text interpretation match the contextual. So this is also a very important principle of interpretation, trying to strike down a balance between the principle of literal interpretation and contextual or the purposive interpretation. So what it says is that we must try to strike the balance between the two, because text give its texture and the context gives any provision of the law its color. Further, one of the important principle of law is to know as to why, what was the mischief which is sought to be remedied by interpreting, by enactment of a act or amendment of an act. So one of the judgment says that a statute is best interpreted when we know why it was enacted. With this knowledge, the statute must be read first as a whole, then section by section, clause by clause, phrase by phrase, and word by word. If a statute is looked at in the context of its enactment with the glasses of statute maker provided by such context, his schemes, the sections, clauses, phrases, and the word may take color and appear different than when the statute is looked at without the glasses provided by the context. Now, whenever we start reading any law or an act, then the first thing which we need to interpret or understand is the definition section, which is usually section 2 of any act. Now, while reading the definition, there are some interesting and important principles which has emerged over a period of time. Now, if you look at any definition section, which is usually section 2, then you will find that it starts with unless the context otherwise requires. So the definition, even if given in the act, but if it is used in the manner in a particular section that the context requires it to be interpreted in the different way, then one can even overlook what is defined in the act. So if the context requires, then the definition given in a section can be rejected or ignored, and the definition which is more common sense can be adopted. And which is the principle with respect to interpretation of a provision which is not defined in the act. So if it is not defined, then it should be given its meaning, which is ordinary dictionary meaning or as is understood in the common parlance. Now the definition may start with a particular word, that it may be an inclusive definition or it may be an exhaustive definition. So if the definition uses the word means, then it is a hard and fast and exhaustive definition, and no other meaning can be assigned to the expression than what is put down in the definition, unless the context otherwise requires. So that is always there, unless the context requires. If the context requires, then even the exhaustive definition which starts with the word means can be ignored. But 99% of the time, the means, the use of the word means in a definition indicates that it is a exhaustive definition and no other meaning can be assigned to the expression. But if the word includes is there, then it enlarges the meaning of the expression defined so as to comprehend not only the things which they signify, but also things which the clause declares they shall include. So means and includes means an exhaustive explanation of the meaning, which invariably should not be departed. Now let us have a look at how the explanation, what is the meaning of the explanation in a statute, or what is the meaning of the proviso. Yeah, usually you see the explanation is given to explain the meaning of the particular provision. If there is a scope of any ambiguity or doubt, then a explanation is inserted to explain what is already there in the section. So explanation cannot whittle down or reduce or take away what is already what appears from the literal and the purposive interpretation of a statute. All that it does is to provide an additional support to further explain and remove the vagueness and the obscurity or any scope of misinterpretation. But of course, it cannot take away or reduce what is there in the main section. But proviso has a altogether different purpose. Proviso serves usually for purpose, and I'm quoting it from an Honorable Supreme Court judgment. It says that it qualifies or give exception to certain provision from the main enactment. So either it qualifies or provide exceptions, or it may entirely change the meaning depending on with respect to a different context. Sometimes the proviso are so elaborate that they are a section in themselves, so they can be a separate section also, depending on the facts and circumstance of a particular provision. And sometimes proviso are used as an explanation also. So while proviso may be an explanation, but an explanation can never be a proviso. Give me 1 or 2 minutes, please. Now, another important principle of interpretation is nostire socis and eudem generis. Now, nostire socis means when two or more words are capable of being analogously defined, then they take color from each other. So if two words are put together and they are analogous in nature and they are differently defined, then they take color from each other. Whereas the rule of eudem generis says that if the general nature of word follows a particular or the specific word, then the general word take its color from the specific words. For example, in a judgment, the phrase any other person was there in rule 6D2 of the income tax rule, and it was preceded by the word employee. So it was held that the any other person cannot mean trustee, because trustee and employee are not akin. So if the any other person is preceded by the word employee, then only the person who has the character of an employee, who satisfies the meaning of the word employee, they can only be covered within the purview of the phrase any other person. And the trustee cannot be considered to be an employee. So this is the meaning of the eudem generis. Now, another very important and useful principle of interpretation is that if there is a choice or conflict between a procedural and a substantive provision, then the procedural provision should give way to the substantive provision. It is possible that there are several conditions in a statute, but there may be conditions which are in the nature of the procedural, and there are some conditions which are substantive conditions. So even if one fails to comply with the procedural provision, if suppose any benefit is given by the law, then because of the failure of the such procedural provision, the substantive provisions cannot be diluted and the benefit of substantive provision cannot be taken away. So if something is a matter of policy, then that the matter of policy will prevail, and if something is a matter of procedure, then the procedural provisions cannot come in the way of implementation of a policy provision or a substantive provision. Now, we very frequently come across non-obstant clause, which start with notwithstanding. So if there is a non-obstante clause, then that non-obstante clause usually means that this provision will prevail despite anything to contrary in the provision. So if there is an inconsistency between one provision and the another, then the one which start with a non-obstant clause should prevail and the other provisions should give way to it. For example, section 16 subsection 4. Sorry, section 16 subsection 2. It starts with notwithstanding anything contained in this section. So section 16 subsection 2 is a non-obstant clause provision or section. So section 16 subsection 4, which restricts the taking of the input tax credit subject to filing of the return within a particular period of time, that should give way to section 16 subsection 2, which starts with notwithstanding anything contained in this section. So if notwithstanding anything contained in this section is removed, then the entire meaning of this particular phrase will become redundant. Now, another very important principle of interpretation is lex non cogit ad impossibilia. Means which the law cannot compel a person to do something which he cannot be reasonably expected to perform. So if the law creates a duty on a person and that person is disabled to perform it without any fault on his part and has no control over it, then the law will or law should excuse him. However, mandatory may be the provision if there is an impossibility of compliance on the part of a citizen, then that would be a sufficient excuse for non-compliance. So there are several judgments to this effect, and I think this principle is going to come to aid in the interpretation of section 16(2)(c), which mandates that unless the tax is paid by the supplier, the input tax credit will not be admissible. So our contention can be that it is impossible for a buyer to ensure that his supplier pays the tax to the government. It is not in his hand. There is no way he can ensure that. So therefore, section 16(2)(c) should not be treated as a mandatory, and the benefit of it should not come to the benefit of it cannot be denied to the SSC. Now, another important principle is that the law does not concern itself with the trifles. So if there are, say, minor exceptions which are not so important, then for such minor infractions, a SSC should not be penalized or punished. That is the meaning of the phrase de minimis non curret lex. Now let us come to the interpretation of the exemption notification. Now there was a very celebrated and well discussed, I think most of you must be aware of this particular Supreme Court judgment in Delhi, Commissioner of Customs versus Dilip Kumar. So here the Honorable Supreme Court very beautiful laid down the principles of interpretation, and I think one should definitely read this particular section because it deals with most of the principles of interpretation, not just principles of interpretation with respect to the exemption, but for the tax practitioner, this is a must read. So it says that the penal provisions should be strictly interpreted, and similarly the charging provision should also be strictly interpreted. There was an ambiguity with respect to the interpretation of the exemption notifications or exemption clauses in a particular taxation law. So it was said that if there is any ambiguity in either charging provision, then the benefit should go to the SSC. But if there is an ambiguity in the interpretation of the exemption notification, then the benefits of ambiguity should go in favor of the revenue. So this is with respect to the interpretation. So while interpreting, if there is two meaning possible with respect to the levy of the tax, then the benefit goes to the SSC. But if there are two views possible, with respect to the exemption, then that goes to the revenue, that goes to the revenue. But subsequent to this Dilip Kumar judgment, there is another judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court, which has diluted the strict interpretation construction of a exemption provision. And it said there is a long line of authority which said that even exemption provision should be liberally constructed in accordance with the object sought to be achieved, is the provision purpose is to grant incentive for promoting economic growth or otherwise has some beneficial reason behind it. So the Honorable Supreme Court said that we cannot ignore the object and purpose of a exemption notification. And if the exemption notification is not general in nature, it has a specific purpose, then that interpretation which gives the fruit of such purpose, that interpretation should be adopted. So virtually it says that in the matter of the exemption notification also, the benefit of doubt should go to the SSC provided it has some beneficial purpose and it is not general in nature. Now another important principle of interpretation, or rather I would say the principle of binding precedence of a judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court. I think one of the important principle is that the judgment should not be read as a provision of the statutes. They should always be read in the context which they are made, and they cannot be taken out of the context and read as a theorem. So this is a very important principle. And also one of the principle is that we should look for what is the ratio of the judgment. And it is the ratio which creates the binding precedent and not what the observations are. There are observations in the course of making a judgment, but they are obiter dicta. They do not have any precedential value. So while determining the ratio of a judgment, we need to look into what was the question which was before the Honorable Court. And it are only those observation or the ratio of the law which is laid down in the context of those questions which creates binding precedence and not otherwise. Now, the last thing which I would like to discuss today is with respect to the importance of the General Clauses Act 1897. Now, it is possible that some of the provisions are not defined in the particular act. So there are some commonly used words which are defined in the General Clauses Act, like affidavit, document, immovable property, movable property, writing. So these terminologies we can adopt or should adopt from the General Clauses Act, the manner in which they are defined in the General Clauses Act. For example, the word immovable property is not defined even though used in section 17 subsection 5. So if it is not defined, then the meaning which is there in General Clauses Act, that is the land or the benefit arising of the land and things attached to earth and permanently fastened to anything attached to earth, that should be the meaning of the immovable property. The meaning of the document, which says that any matter written, expressed, or described upon any substance by means of the letter, figures, or marks, or by one of these means, can be considered to be a document. Now, there are some other important provisions also. For example, we see that the timeline for doing any act is given in the law. For example, timeline for claiming refund or filing of the appeal and all that. So section 9 says when the time will commence and terminate. It says that we need to include the we should exclude the first day. So suppose if say within 60 days we are supposed to file an appeal from the date of the receipt of the order, then the date of the receipt of the order has to be excluded and the date on which it is filed has to be included. So first day is always excluded in terms of section 9 of the General Clauses Act. Now, how do we compute the time? Say how 60 days are to be computed. Now, for computation of the 60 days, it says that if any court or the office is closed, so if there is a holiday on the last day, which is wherein an act is prescribed to be done, then that day, if it happens to be the last date, not the all days, so within 60 days, suppose there are 5 holidays, they will not be excluded for computation of 60 days. But if suppose by any chance, the last date for filing of the appeal falls on a Sunday or say Saturday, which happens to be the holiday in the office, then that will be excluded. Now, gender, it says that any mention of a masculine gender or female gender shall include the plural, singular, plural, and vice versa. So, female, if the word male will include female and singular shall include plural and vice versa. Further, section 26 says that when the offenses are punishable under 2 or more enactments, then the offender shall only be liable to be prosecuted and punished under either or any of those enactments, but shall not be liable to be punished twice for the same offense. Now, if any act, if the act requires to serve any document by post, then the service shall be deemed to be effected by properly addressing, prepaying, and posting by the registered post, and unless the contrary is proved to be effected at the time at which the letter would be delivered in the ordinary course of post. So as soon as you deliver it, it will be deemed that it has been effected, service has been effected. So friends, with this, I conclude my today's session. If you have any question, then I would be happy to answer them. Madam, the Mr. Abhijit Bandyopadhyay is saying that none of the presentation is received. Madam, are you there?
Yes, sir.
So why the participants are complaining that they have not received the PPT? I have shared with you all the PPTs.
Yes, sir. We have already shared the PPT to all the registrants who have registered through the Google form. Okay, I'm sharing my number here in the chat box. You
Please
can
share your number as well as your email ID. So
Yeah,
they will
sure,
write
sir,
to
sure.
you for the presentation if they have not received.
Sir, I have shared the number and email ID here in the chat box.
Right.
Yeah. If there is any query regarding the PPT and recordings, you can contact me in this number.
And all the recordings are also available in YouTube. That also
Yeah,
participants should know. They are all of them are available on YouTube. So if anybody wants to uh, again hear this presentation and the hearing of this thing, then they can do so again. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank
It
you
was
so
a
much,
real
sir.
delight for me to be with you all, and I really thank from my bottom of my heart to all of you for being with me for all these sessions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. On
There
behalf
is
of
one.
TaxCan.
There are a couple of questions which have come. The GST Act enacted to control the cascading effect of SAC, but it blocked the ITC on card purchase. Is it override the objective of the enactment? Yes, Mr. Chandrasekhar, and I agree with you that it does have restrict. And in fact, one of such matter with respect to immovable property is already there, where Section 17(5) clause C has been challenged. So let us see what happens in this matter. This matter is listed in the Honorable Supreme Court in the 3rd week of July. And I hope that the Supreme Court answers your query. Now, next question is from Mr. Gopalan. Valuation of exported goods under Section 15, read with Rule 34 as transaction value. Can department interpret transaction value actually paid or payable on exported goods as per the amount in the FIRC at the time of receipt of the payment? No, I don't think transaction value has anything to do with the amount which you received. Sometimes the amount is not received also. So it does not matter. You have to interpret valuation as per Section 15 only, and don't relate it to the payment received. Now again, Mr. Chandrasekhar is asking, shall we take ITC on the car used? No, sir, don't take ITC as of now. Let us wait for the Supreme Court judgment. Okay, with this, we can conclude today's session.
Yes, sir. I guess there is no more queries left.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir. On behalf of TaxCan and all of you, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Shall we wind up, sir?
Yes, yes.